Hey, good morning. It's Pastor Doug, and I'm here to join you for another study in the Gospel of Mark as we're looking at the good news and studying our way through this great gospel reminder of Jesus's life, his ministry, and what he came to bring to us. We've just finished where he was at the Capernaum synagogue and had a time there beginning to reveal himself. And immediately, we're told, as we pick up in chapter 1, verse 29, after the crowds came out of the synagogue, and I'm reading this from the New American Standard Version, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her, and he came to her and raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she waited on them. When evening came, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed. And the whole city had gathered at the door, and he healed many who were ill with various diseases, and cast out many demons. He was not permitting the demons to speak, because they knew who he was. In the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place, and was praying there. Simon and his companions searched for him. They found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go somewhere else, to the towns nearby, so that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for." And he went into the synagogues throughout Galilee, preaching and casting out the demons. And a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him, and saying, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. I lost my place there. Immediately, verse 42, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he sternly warned them, and immediately sent them away. He said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer your cleansing, what Moses commanded, as a testimony to them." But when he went out and began to proclaim it freely and spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere. Well, that is quite the experience, from being gathered together on the Sabbath in the synagogue, having some amazing things take place. You've noticed as we go through the study that Mark uses the word immediately a lot, uthu, straight away. As we go through this gospel, it's referred to the gospel of action, because we get one thing after another. They're connected together with this word, straight away, straight away, straight away. So, straight away, after they came out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon. Now, I always heard it referred to as Simon's mother-in-law's house. It is where she was at, but here it seems to indicate that this house belonged to Simon, or at least Simon and his brother Andrew. At least it was referred to as their house. So they weren't penniless paupers. They were part of a family that had a business, and they had a home to live in Capernaum. If you go over to Israel, you'll get to go through some of the ruins that show there, or right now you can go virtually, you can Google it online, Capernaum, Peter's house, or Peter's mother-in-law, or Simon, and you will find that there. There was Simon and his brother Andrew with James, and as we talked earlier in this study, the Greek says Jacob, and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law. I know that today we have lots of jokes about mother-in-laws. I used to tease my mother-in-law all the time saying, hey, you know the difference between in-laws and outlaws, don't you? And she'd always say, what? And I'd say, well, outlaws are wanted. And she'd laugh and I'd laugh. And later on, she said it took her a long time to realize that she could say the same thing about me. We've always enjoyed one another, and it seems like Peter had a great relationship. Simon had a great relationship with his mother-in-law, which also implies, although it's not said, that Simon had a wife. You don't get a mother-in-law without getting married. And so Simon was married, had a wife, obviously had a mother-in-law. We don't hear anything about her. We don't hear whether they had children or not. That's part of the story that's not included because we're focused on the ministry of Jesus and the good news that he brings. And sometimes a lot of those questions we have just don't get answered. Anyways, his mother was lying sick. That is, that she was down, katakito. I pronounce those Greek words wrong, but that's just mainly to have laid down. Interesting enough, same word for them for being deceptive as far as presenting a falsehood. But it could be used either way of someone who was down or someone who was misrepresenting the truth. She was down, and mine says that she was sick with a fever, but it actually is a word that means to be burning up. Just like we would say of someone who's really sick, we say, man, they're on fire. They are burning up. That's exactly what they said back then. She was sick. She was running a high temperature. They didn't know what to do with her. They didn't have the kind of medications that we have today to even deal with something that to us would be maybe still frightening, but not life-threatening. We have ways to kind of figure out what the body is doing when it begins to build that strong, strong fever. But Jesus doesn't give her medication. We get that term, euthus, straight away, immediately. Jesus instead speaks to her. So they go, they speak to Jesus about her. I said, Jesus speaks to her. They went and found Jesus and spoke to Jesus about her. Jesus came to her and raised her up. This term for raised her up, egero, is the same word that gets used to talk about the resurrection. Whenever Jesus rose from the dead, exact same word. But she wasn't dead. She was just extremely sick. But it's that same idea of rising up. And he took her by the hand. There are lots of songs that kind of give an indication that we sing about almost romanticizing the idea of Jesus taking us by the hand. There's a comfort in that touch with one another, of tenderness, of care and compassion. And when he did, the fever, that burning up, left her. So Jesus came to her, raised her up by taking her by the hand. Doesn't tell us that he said anything. But sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. But he had the power to heal, and he did so. Interesting enough that whenever she was healed, she began to take care of them. And it's the diakoneo word that we also end up using, deacon. We get the word deacon out of it, diakonos. And at its basic root, it means to go back and forth. And it was often used to refer to a servant, because a servant was the one, if the main guys were, say, sitting down to dinner, and they would be at one of those U-shaped tables, stone, where they were reclining on there, leaning against it. Someone had to go back and forth. So Peter's house was also a pretty good size house to be able to have a big room for that meal time in it. And they did go back and forth. But instead of a servant, it was Peter's mother-in-law. She was the one who was taking care of them. And it's interesting that, we could even go into an idea of it was that whenever Jesus heals you, whether it's some physical kind of a thing or just a spiritually speaking, whenever he breaks the bondage of sin, our immediate response should be like Peter's mother-in-law. It should be to serve him, to see what we can do for him. And a lot of the things that we do in our lives in response to his healing is in the area of service. We're all ministers in that sense. Minister is just the Latin word for servant. Deacon is just the one that we use to talk about a specific office in the church, but it's just the term servant. In fact, very often, whenever Jesus referred to himself as a servant, he used the feminine form. In those days, very often, the women were the ones who were doing a lot of the service in the house. And that's what we find here. So he stays in the house, all of them there. And it says, when evening came, after the sun had set, which may not be so important for us, but that's the beginning of the new day for them. They went from sunset through the next morning, next day, start of a new day, whenever the next sun set. We just use it with the rising sun. And whenever this new day began, when the sun set, they began bringing to him, a reference to Jesus, all who were ill. In the word ill here is the word kakos. It's the word that gets translated evil more than any other place, but it's also in reference to whenever your body is physically not doing well. It was considered bad, evil in that sense. Not that it's possessed of something evil, it's just that it's not working right. But there's a distinction between those who are physically sick and those who were demon possessed. And so we get this term coming into us that we already had earlier in our study, that there are people for whom a demon can possess them and make them mimic those who are sick, or make them act in strange ways, obviously not well. And we see this a lot. But there's a difference. Not everyone with a demon possession acts sick. Remember, just earlier in the synagogue, there was a guy who was there, and he was doing just fine. Nobody even knew he was sick until he calls out and has that confrontation with Jesus. So there's a lot of mystery that sort of surrounds the difference between these two. A lot of arguments and talks about it. Demons are certainly real, just as angels are today, and possession can still happen. Just as it did back then. And Jesus is still the power that sets us free from it. But they said, hey, we don't know what to do with this. It was something that they didn't have an answer for, even though they were God's people, even though they were going to the synagogues, even though they were trying to live by the law of Moses. They didn't have an answer for their sicknesses, their illnesses, and not their demon possessions. The whole city gathers, it says, at the door. Now, I don't know if you can get the whole city of Capernaum, what size it was at that time. There's a lot of guesses. It was a pretty good-sized village. I don't know if everyone was there crowded around the door, but it was a big crowd. It represented the entire city. And Jesus healed. It's from the word therapeuo, the word healed here. You get the word therapy from it today. And so as he's going through there, he is providing the therapy that they need. Actually, from the therapeuo, it's from a word that actually means to heat up, but the idea of heating up to a warmth or the sunshine or making yourself feel better. And so it was that idea of maybe going from the chills to having the return of the normal warmth of the body. And so we get this word for therapy of getting warmed up in a healthy sense. And he did that with all who had various diseases. And this time it's a different word, the word kakos. It's the word nocios. And this time it's just a word, a wide-ranging collection of different sicknesses that someone might have. Deformities even could be lumped into the same category of words. And he also cast out many demons. So there was that different kinds of ways that we had these different people who were being healed. And these demons, he was not permitting to speak, just like the one in the synagogue. They knew who he was, but he didn't want their testimony, because even though they knew who he was, they didn't honor him or follow him or believe in him. So after that day, early in the morning, remember it's nighttime, he evidently works with these people all through the night. It was a late night, and he still gets up early. So he's sort of a night owl and a morning person. He gets up while it's still dark, and he leaves the house. And he goes to, mine says it's a secluded place. Don't know what your Bible says. And it just is a word for empty or vacant. And there he prays. Now, the word for praying here is the typical word you might find for prayer in prosukomai, pros, toward, you, good, ekomai, to have. And so their basic word for prayer was to want good toward. Seeking God and saying, yeah, we want good, and we know you're the one who can bring the good. And so we come to you seeking good. That's kind of a good way, a general way to talk about our own prayers. Well, Simon and his companions, so at least we know Andrew, James, and John are out looking for him, searching him, and they do find him. And the reason they're out looking for him is because it says, everybody's looking for you, Jesus. Well, of course they are. Here he is. He spent the evening healing people. They're all wanting to see him, to be around him for a variety of different reasons. And they're wanting to be healed by him. But Jesus says, let us go somewhere else. Let us go to one of the towns. And the term for town here is Komopolis. Como is a word, or chemo, when you get to the lower root, to be laid out or spread out. Polis, the people. And it's the idea of a city or a village or a town where people get and, they have that, what we would call urban spread. They started getting out around the places or together. And so they said, let's go to those. That I may preach, keruse, the word to announce, to herald, because that's what I came for. Now he is healing people, caring for them, because he's moved for compassion. He wants to take care of them in that way. But his real reason for being there is to announce the good news, to announce that God loves them, that God has a plan to forgive them, that God knows where they're at. They're his people, his sheep. And he wants them to know that God loves him and that he sent his son for them. And so he wants this message to be brought to those people, not by demons who don't believe, but those who do trust God, those who have a relationship with God, those who want to be under his authority and be his people and live with him forever. And Jesus came, as he might say, to seek and to save the lost. And that's the greatest thing that we can receive from him, is his word to us of his love, of his grace, of his mercy, of his willingness to forgive us when we give our lives to him. And he went into their synagogues. Everywhere he goes to Galilee, he goes to the synagogues. We don't hear about the individual stories of those. And he goes around preaching at these synagogues. I mean, if you had Jesus show up, you'd probably change your worship schedule and say, yes, man, we want to hear from you. It is this word, kerusso, to announce, to proclaim, to let people know who Jesus is. Not only that, but he's also casting out more demons. I don't know about you, but this is a big theme. There are evidently a lot of people in those villages who were possessed by demons. We aren't told how they were, or the things that happened to them, but they recognized Jesus. There's a spiritual battle. He has authority over them, and he can throw them out, and they have to go. At one of these synagogues, verse 40 now, a leper, and they didn't have a cure for leprosy back then, came to Jesus and was beseeching him. The word parakaleo, to call along the side of. It's their word for aid or help. And he's crying out, falling on his knees. So when we get this idea of following, you might hear of some churches that have genuflecting. It's that same word, gono or garnero, idea of being down on your knees, showing submission and humility. And he says, if you are willing, Phileo, you can make me catharsis. You can make me clean. And mine says moved with compassion in verse 41. When I saw that, I just almost glanced right over it, and I thought, no, I'll go ahead and take a look, see what word is under the text. And I was a little surprised by the word that's there, because it's the word orge. Orge is the word that gets translated anger almost everywhere else. It's usually a term for passion. Now, often the other words for compassion they have is a word for splonk, to feel the compassion in here, or to show mercy. But this is a sort of a unique word that's getting translated compassion. It's this same kind of heat. It's a heat word, another heat word in our text that just builds this person up, builds inside this person. But for Jesus, rather than being expressed in anger, it's expressed in care for this person. He stretches out his hands and he touches him. Again, that personal touch that Jesus has. He didn't have to, doesn't need to. He didn't even have to say anything, but he stretches it out and he does say something. He says, I am willing. I love that on Jesus's lips. I am willing, and be cleansed. And that's what this man needed. He needed to be cleansed. And so he was catharsis. We use that term still today. And he is cleansed. Immediately, straight away, immediately, the leprosy left. And he was cleansed. He being Jesus, was sternly warning him, this now non-leper, to immediately go away. And he wanted him to go and not say anyone to anybody. He wanted him to go, show himself to the priest, offer his sacrifices as Moses commanded him, as a witness, as a martyrus to them. Why did Jesus not want him to say anything? Remember, Jesus' purpose was to go to the synagogues and he wanted to preach the good news. And the more that people heard that they could be healed, that's what they wanted. They wanted to turn Jesus' ministry in one to a physical healing. And while Jesus did it out of this burning passion in his life, he didn't have something even greater to share. He wanted to proclaim to them God's love. He wanted to proclaim God's plan, God's kingdom that had come. He wanted to share with them God's desire to break them free from the bondage of sin and make a new covenant with them by which they would be saved. But he didn't really get the opportunity to do that as much because this guy disobeyed Jesus. This guy did not go show himself to the priest. He did not keep it to himself. He did not make the offerings. Now, maybe at some point he might have. We're not told he didn't, but we are told what he did. He went out and he proclaimed it freely. He went out and he used the same word that was translated when Jesus preached. He went out preaching. He went out proclaiming, and he did so freely. And he spread the news. Now it's just the logos word there. It's not euangelion, not good news. He just spread the logos. He spread the word around. And he did it to such an extent that Jesus couldn't go publicly into a center. His plan was to go into the synagogues and start there and go out. And this guy's gone around, and now there's so many people. Every time Jesus showed up, everybody's out there. He can't even follow his plan A, but Jesus always has a plan B. He goes out to the unpopulated places. Instead of going to the laid out places where the people are out, he just goes to these areas, and this word unpopulated, the same word that was sort of an empty place where he went to pray to start with, and he has to wait for the people to come to him. That's a big difference. Jesus wanted to go to the people, be where the heart of the people was, be in the synagogues and preach from there, and then move out into the city. But now he's got to be out in the country, and he has to wait for these people to come to him, and they are wanting to. They are coming from everywhere. And that is great to see, that even though the plan A wasn't working, plan B is working great. And so Jesus is now in these unpopulated places, and the people are flocking to him. And whenever we share our story of how Jesus changed us, the difference that he made in our lives, that we are completely different, we're healed, that we're set apart, and our lives are better, as we share that news of what Jesus has done for us, it is going to get other people who are in similar circumstances flocking to Jesus so that they too might receive from his hand. Right, that's our lesson for today. We'll pick up in chapter 2 and our next installment. May God bless you, and may you turn to Jesus and follow him too.